The final scene of his play mirrored his death. Line for chilling line. Welcome to Marple Casebook. I am your host, Selwyn. Mystery fans around the world, drop a comment and share where you're watching from. Your insights always add magic to these stories. Let's begin. The rain had been steady all afternoon, a fine mist settling over London like a shroud, rendering the street lamps pale and ghostly against the cobbled pavement. Inside the dimly lit study of playwright Nathaniel Pomeroy, the air was thick with the scent of aged paper, ink, and a lingering trace of cigar smoke. The curtains were drawn, the hearth cold, and the only sound was the ticking of an ornate grandfather clock in the corner. Until the moment Inspector Arthur Cray of Scotland Yard turned the brass handle and stepped inside. Nathaniel Pomeroy was slumped over his writing desk, a single stab wound to his back, his body stiff with the finality of death. A man murdered at his own desk was not unusual in Inspector Cray's line of work. What puzzled him was the scene itself. A fresh script lay open before the victim, pages filled with neat typewritten text. The title read, "The Final Curtain." In the last paragraph, a character, named most curiously Nathaniel, was described as slumping forward, lifeless, a knife buried in his back. The murder on the page mirrored the murder in reality. The inspector bent closer. The ink on the final words was dry but fresh enough to suggest Pomeroy had typed them within the last few hours. Next to the script lay a pen, an untouched glass of brandy, and a small silver letter opener. The murder weapon was missing. The study was locked from the inside with no sign of forced entry. Outside, a sheer drop from the second-story window made an escape unlikely. Yet the crime had been committed, clearly and unmistakably, while Pomeroy had been alone. The housekeeper, Mrs. Hawthorne, had found the body when she entered with the evening tea. The locked door had to be forced open by the constable. Inspector Cray sighed. It was one of those cases, the kind where everything was too perfectly inexplicable. By the time Miss Marple arrived the following afternoon, the study had been photographed, dusted for fingerprints, and thoroughly examined by Scotland Yard. Nothing had yielded an answer. The elderly woman stepped inside with an air of quiet observation, her eyes lingering on the desk, the window, the bookshelves lined with well-thumbed plays. Dressed in a neat tweed coat, a hat perched primly atop her head, she looked rather more suited to a parish meeting than a murder investigation, but Cray had long learned not to underestimate her. "I hear," she said, her voice gentle yet knowing, "that Mr. Pomeroy's final words were of his own making." Cray nodded. "C'est a morbid coincidence. Or not a coincidence at all." She took a step closer to the desk, her gloved fingers hovering over the typewritten pages but not touching them. "This must have been the last thing he wrote." "That's the working theory," Cray admitted. "But we found no intruder, no weapon, and no way for the killer to leave." Miss Marple's gaze swept the room, taking in the small details, the dust on the bookshelves, the way the chair was slightly askew, the faint trace of something floral lingering in the air. She leaned in, sniffing delicately. "Lavender?" The inspector frowned. Mrs. Hawthorne mentioned nothing of the sort. Miss Marple gave a small, satisfied smile. "Then it's not hers." She turned back to the desk, glancing at the final, damning words of the final curtain. "The real question, Inspector, is whether Mr. Pomeroy was writing about himself, or if someone else was writing the ending for him." Miss Marple leaned forward, her gaze lingering on the crisp pages of the final curtain. Her fingers, clad in soft kid gloves, hovered over the script without touching it. The typewritten words were precise, almost methodical, detailing Nathaniel Pomeroy's fictional death in a manner that had now become his reality. It was a most theatrical crime, and something about that fact unsettled her deeply. Inspector Cray shifted beside her, rubbing his chin. If he wrote this himself just before dying, it's eerie, but not impossible. and yet I can't shake the feeling that someone else had a hand in it." Miss Marple straightened, her expression mild. "That is because someone most certainly did, Inspector." She turned from the desk, her gaze sweeping the study with quiet, practiced attention. The thick velvet curtains at the window, the grandfather clock, the shelves of scripts and first editions. Nothing seemed amiss at first glance. But Miss Marple had long since learned that evil rarely presented itself in dramatic flourishes. No, it hid in the smallest, most ordinary details. She took a few careful steps toward the fireplace, peering at the faint smudges of soot on the tiles. A fire had not been lit, but something had disturbed the ashes recently. She bent slightly, studying the pattern. Not accidental. Something or someone had brushed against it. She straightened, her attention shifting again. "Mrs. Hawthorne found the body, I believe?" Cray nodded. "Housekeeper of 20 years, devoted by all accounts. She said she brought up his evening tea, found the door locked, and had to call the constable. No one entered or left." Miss Marple glanced at the window. "Locked?" "Bolted from the inside," Cray confirmed. She walked to the window, inspecting the latch. It was secure. But something about the sill drew her eye, a faint streak, as though something had been dragged across the wood. A long, narrow smudge. It was barely noticeable, but she had seen enough dusted windowsills in her time to know when one had been disturbed. Before she could speak, there was a knock at the door. A young constable stepped in, looking somewhat flustered. "Inspector, there's a Miss Evelyn March downstairs. Says she was a friend of the deceased. She insists on speaking with you." Cray exhaled heavily. "I suppose I'd best see what she wants." Miss Marple offered a pleasant smile. "Might I join you, Inspector? I do think she might have something interesting to say." Cray hesitated only a moment before nodding. Downstairs in the drawing room, Miss Evelyn March was pacing. A striking woman in her early 30s, she wore a dark green coat, her dark hair pinned back with a jeweled comb. The fingers of one hand twisted nervously around the clasp of her handbag. At the sight of them, she stilled, smoothing her coat with a practiced motion. "Inspector," she said, her voice steady, but her eyes darting between him and Miss Marple. I had to come. When I read about Nathaniel's death, She took a sharp breath. "I knew something was wrong." Cray raised an eyebrow. "What makes you say that, Miss March?" Evelyn hesitated, then set her handbag down on the table. "Nathaniel and I were close once. I knew how his mind worked. He was fascinated with crime, certainly, but he would never stage his own death like this. It's all wrong." Miss Marple regarded her with gentle curiosity. "Forgive me, my dear, but I wonder, what precisely do you mean by wrong?" Evelyn's fingers clenched briefly before she let them relax. Nathaniel was a meticulous writer. Every detail mattered. And yet the scene in that script, it's contrived. It feels deliberate, as though it's meant to mislead. She exhaled. "It's not his writing." Cray frowned. "You're saying someone else wrote the scene?" "I'm saying someone finished it." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "That is a very interesting distinction, Miss March." Evelyn's gaze dropped for the briefest moment. When she lifted it again, her expression was carefully composed. Nathaniel had been troubled lately. He said he was being watched, that someone had been in his home, moving things. At first I thought he was imagining it, but now— Her voice faltered. Miss Marple studied her closely. Evelyn March had come here under the pretense of concern, yet something about her manner suggested more than grief. There was tension in the way she held herself, the way her fingers toyed with the clasp of her handbag. A woman who knew more than she was willing to say. Before Miss Marple could press her further, a voice called from the hallway. "Inspector Cray!" A second constable appeared, breathless. "Sir, we've just found something in the study, inside the fireplace." Miss Marple exchanged a knowing glance with Cray before following him swiftly up the stairs. Back in the study, a constable was crouched by the hearth, carefully lifting something from the ashes with gloved hands. A charred scrap of paper, edges curled with heat, the ink barely legible but still visible in places. Cray leaned in. "What is it?" The constable turned it slightly. The faint, burned words became clearer. "Can't trust her. She knows." Miss Marple's expression remained placid, but her mind was already whirring. Someone had tried to destroy this note, someone who had been in this very room either before or after Nathaniel Pomeroy's death. And now the first thread of deception had begun to unravel. Inspector Cray turned the burned scrap over in his gloved fingers, his expression darkening. The faintly legible words, "Can't trust her. She knows," clung to the page like a whisper from beyond the grave. He shot a glance at Miss Marple, who, despite her usual mild expression, had a glint in her eye that suggested she was already fitting this fragment into place. "Can't trust who?" Cray muttered. "And what did she know?" Miss Marple smoothed her gloves thoughtfully. "A note hastily destroyed is always very telling, Inspector, and the fact that it was in the fireplace suggests someone wanted it gone in a hurry." Cray exhaled, then straightened. "Right, let's see if our witnesses can shed some light on this, starting with Miss March." Downstairs, Evelyn March had taken a seat, her posture stiff, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The moment they entered, she looked up sharply, as though she had been waiting for them. "We found something," Cray said without preamble. He held out the scrap of paper. "Recognize the handwriting?" Evelyn reached out, hesitated for the briefest moment, then took the fragile fragment delicately between her fingers. She studied it, her brows drawing together. "It's Nathaniel's, I think. Or at least it looks like his." "You don't sound certain," Cray noted. Evelyn set the note down carefully on the table. Nathaniel had a very precise way of writing, but it looks rushed, almost frantic. If he wrote this, he was afraid. Miss Marple observed her reaction with quiet interest. "And who, my dear, do you think he might not have trusted?" A flicker of hesitation. A calculated pause. Then, "I don't know." A lie, Miss Marple thought, but an interesting one. Evelyn was too controlled for an innocent woman. She had come here claiming to seek justice, yet her every word seemed carefully measured, as though she was choosing what to reveal. Before Cray could press further, the door creaked open and Mrs. Hawthorne, the housekeeper, appeared in the doorway. "I don't mean to interrupt," she said, her voice tight with worry, "but if you'll be speaking to people, you ought to talk to Mr. Lester. He's been asking all sorts of questions about what you found." Cray's eyes narrowed. "Lester?" "The understudy," Evelyn supplied. "Jonathan Lester. He worked closely with Nathaniel, helping to refine scripts." Miss Marple's brow lifted slightly. "Understudy?" Evelyn's lips thinned. Nathaniel planned to star in his own play. It was a vanity project, but he had the talent for it. Jonathan was his standby in case anything happened. And of course, if Nathaniel were to be removed from the picture, Jonathan would take the lead. Miss Marple glanced at Inspector Cray, who was already motioning for the constable to bring Lester in. A few moments later, Jonathan Lester entered, his expression perfectly composed. He was a handsome man in his late 30s, dressed immaculately, though his dark eyes held a restless energy. He moved with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, yet his gaze darted to the note on the table before he quickly looked away. "I understand I'm to be questioned." His voice was smooth, but Miss Marple detected the slight upward lilt at the end, an attempt at nonchalance, not entirely successful. "We're speaking with everyone who had close ties to Mr. Pomeroy," Cray said evenly. "And as his understudy, you were rather close, weren't you?" Lester offered a tight smile. "As close as one can be to a man like Nathaniel. He was brilliant, but also secretive. He kept his cards close. He gestured vaguely. I respected him immensely, of course. And yet, Miss Marple said pleasantly, it must have been frustrating, to always wait in the wings. Lester's eyes flickered toward her, wary now. I understood my role. Did you? Miss Marple's tone remained light, but her eyes stayed on him. Or did you ever feel that perhaps Nathaniel's departure, however unfortunate, might finally allow you to step into the light? Lester's jaw tightened. That's absurd. Cray leaned in. Where were you the night of the murder? At home, Lester said immediately. Alone. No one to vouch for me, if that's what you're asking. Miss Marple observed how quickly he had answered, as though he had already anticipated the question. A man prepared to defend himself before an accusation had even been made. You were close enough to the production to see the script, she mused. Perhaps even to add to it. Lester's nostrils flared slightly. Are you suggesting I had a hand in writing the final curtain? Miss Marple merely smiled. Oh no, dear. I'm only suggesting that if someone were to frame a murder as though it were merely following the script, they would have to be familiar with the way Nathaniel wrote. Lester's fingers twitched, but he caught himself before showing any further reaction. Before Cray could push further, the constable returned, looking flustered. Inspector, we've got another visitor. Man by the name of Roger Fielding says he was Nathaniel's business partner. Evelyn's head snapped up. Lester, for the first time, looked genuinely surprised. Roger's here, Evelyn said sharply. Cray looked between them. Something tells me this will be interesting. A few moments later, Roger Fielding strode in. He was a solidly built man, neatly dressed, but there was an edge to him, something controlled yet aggressive, like a man accustomed to winning arguments. His eyes swept over the room, taking in Lester, then Evelyn, then the note on the table. Inspector, he said briskly, I've just heard about Nathaniel's death. A tragedy, of course. But I'd like to know where that leaves the production. Miss Marple, who had been watching him carefully, tilted her head. How curious, she said mildly. You've just lost a colleague, and yet your first thought is the play. Fielding's expression didn't falter. Nathaniel and I built something together. It's only natural I'd be concerned. Evelyn was glaring at him now. You didn't just build something together. You fought constantly. Nathaniel was considering cutting you out. Fielding's eyes flicked to her. And where did you hear that? Nathaniel told me. Miss Marple watched the exchange closely. A fascinating dynamic. Evelyn's hostility, Fielding's measured but forceful response. More than professional tensions lay beneath the surface. So, Cray said, tapping the burned note, perhaps you'd like to explain why Nathaniel was warning against trusting someone before he died? Fielding gave a dry chuckle. Nathaniel was paranoid. He saw betrayal everywhere. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. But sometimes, dear, paranoia is simply a mind sensing what the heart already knows. Fielding's jaw tightened. If you're looking for suspects, I suggest you look elsewhere. Miss Marple only smiled. Oh, but that's the thing about the theatre, Mr. Fielding. Every person plays a part. It's just a matter of figuring out who's performing and who's telling the truth. And with that, the unraveling of deception truly began. Miss Marple sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, watching as the tension in the room thickened like the damp London fog outside. The burned note sat between them, its charred edges curling inward, as if trying to conceal the very secret it held. Around her, the faces of Evelyn March, Jonathan Lester, and Roger Fielding told a story more revealing than their words. Inspector Cray, who had been pacing, finally spoke. So far, each of you has a reason to benefit from Pomeroy's death, but what I can't quite piece together is why now. His gaze settled on Fielding. Nathaniel was considering cutting you out, was he? That would have left you without a stake in the play. Fielding's expression remained carefully neutral. "That's speculation," Evelyn scoffed. "Is it? You and Nathaniel had a blazing argument the last time I saw you together." Fielding turned to her, his voice clipped. "Nathaniel and I argued regularly. It was part of our process. That doesn't mean I wanted him dead." Miss Marple's mild voice interjected, soft but certain. "No, but you were concerned about what his departure would mean for the production. And I dare say, Mr. Fielding, you seem to be a man who does not enjoy uncertainty." Fielding didn't respond, but Miss Marple noticed the way his hands flexed against the arm of his chair. A man accustomed to control, suddenly faced with an unpredictable shift. But was that enough for murder? Miss Marple turned her attention to Jonathan Lester. He had been quiet, watching the exchange with a careful detachment, but his fingers twitched every so often against his knee. "Mr. Lester," she said pleasantly. "Nathaniel was meant to star in the final curtain, wasn't he?" Lester nodded. "Yes, he wrote the role for himself. And yet, with him gone, the lead now falls to you." A flicker of something crossed Lester's face. Guilt? Anxiety? He shook his head. "I had no reason to want him dead. If anything, I would have preferred he did perform. The play was his vision. His reputation was the draw." "Ah," Miss Marple murmured. "But an understudy can only wait in the wings so long before he begins to wonder when his moment will come." Lester stiffened. "Are you implying I killed him for a role?" "Not at all, dear," she said with a pleasant smile. "Merely considering all possibilities." Inspector Cray, who had been watching them both closely, exhaled and turned back to Evelyn March. "You said earlier that Nathaniel felt he was being watched. Do you know if he told anyone else?" Evelyn's posture tightened. "No, I don't think so. He was paranoid about it. He barely confided in me." "And yet," Miss Marple mused, "he trusted you enough to tell you he suspected betrayal." Evelyn looked at her sharply. "Yes, because I was one of the few people who actually cared about him. Or," Miss Marple said gently, "because you were the person he most suspected." A hush fell over the room. Evelyn's face drained of color. "That's absurd." "Perhaps, but we must consider it." Miss Marple gestured toward the note. "This was written in desperation, a final thought before death. The question is, was it a warning against you, or were you the intended recipient?" Evelyn swallowed, and for the first time she looked genuinely shaken. She reached for her handbag, fingers trembling slightly as she opened it. After a moment of hesitation, she pulled out a folded piece of paper and set it on the table. "I didn't want to show this before," she admitted, her voice quieter. "But Nathaniel gave me this the day before he died." Cray unfolded the paper. The handwriting matched the burned note, though this one was intact. It read, "If anything happens to me, know that it wasn't an accident." Cray frowned. "Why didn't you come forward with this sooner?" Evelyn looked away. "Because I was scared. I didn't know what to do. I thought maybe I was overreacting." Miss Marple studied her carefully. The fear in Evelyn's voice was real, but fear of what? Exposure, or that she might truly be the next target? Cray exhaled sharply. "So we have a victim who believed he was in danger, 3 people with tangled histories with him, and no clear suspect." Miss Marple tapped her fingers lightly against her handbag. "No single suspect, perhaps. But tell me, Inspector, have you considered the possibility that this crime was not the act of one person alone?" Cray looked at her sharply. "A conspiracy?" "Not necessarily," she said mildly. "But the theater is a world of collaboration, is it not? Even the most brilliant playwright does not work alone." She turned back to the suspects. "Mr. Lester, you knew Nathaniel's habits best. You worked with him closely on revisions." Lester hesitated, then nodded. "Yes. And Mr. Fielding, you had a vested interest in keeping the production on its feet, even if it meant removing an obstacle." Fielding's jaw clenched. If you're suggesting, and Evelyn, Miss Marple interrupted gently, you had the most personal connection to him. You knew his fears, his vulnerabilities. Evelyn's eyes darkened. I didn't kill him. Miss Marple's gaze swept over all three. But what if it was not a single hand that wrote this scene? The room was silent. Cray exhaled through his nose. If you're right, that means we aren't looking for just one killer. Miss Marple nodded. Indeed. And that, Inspector, is what makes this crime so very intriguing. Inspector Cray straightened, rolling his shoulders as if trying to shake off the weight of the tangled case. We need to start pulling this apart. Piece by piece, he said, rubbing his chin. Let's focus on what we do know. Pomeroy was afraid. He thought someone close to him was a threat. And now he's dead in a manner that mimicked his own script. Miss Marple's fingers tapped lightly against the edge of her handbag. And, she added mildly, the one piece of physical evidence we have, a hastily burned note, suggests a desperate attempt to erase something important. Cray gave a grim nod. Right, which means the person who did this wasn't working entirely in the shadows. They made a mistake. A constable rapped on the door, then entered. He was holding a pair of white gloves. Sir, he said to Cray, we found these in the dressing room, tucked behind a prop case. They've got a faint stain, might be blood. Jonathan Lester exhaled sharply. Nathaniel's. Cray took the gloves, turning them over. They were fine kid leather, slightly worn, the kind an actor or gentleman might wear. He held them up to the light, and sure enough, near the base of the fingers was a dark smudge. Not a large stain, but enough to matter. Miss Marple leaned in. How very interesting, she murmured. Gloves are such an inconvenient thing to misplace, don't you think? Cray glanced at the constable. Send them to the lab. If it's Pomeroy's blood, we'll know soon enough. But the question remained. Whose gloves were they? Fielding was already shaking his head. I don't own gloves like that. Jonathan Lester frowned. Neither do I. Evelyn, however, hesitated just a fraction too long. Cray caught it immediately. Miss March? Her lips pressed together. They look like Nathaniel's, she said slowly. But I suppose they could be mine. I had a similar pair. Had? Cray's voice sharpened. I lost them some time ago, she said, a little too quickly. It could be a coincidence. Cray's jaw set. We'll soon see. Hours later, the results came in. The blood on the gloves was indeed Pomeroy's. And the fit, it matched Evelyn March's hands. The room was alive with a different energy now. The inspectors worked swiftly, cataloguing evidence, while Cray turned to Evelyn. It's not looking good for you, he said plainly. Gloves with the victim's blood, found hidden away, that's damning evidence. Evelyn's face was pale. It's not what it looks like. Then tell me what it is. I don't know how they got there, she said. I swear to you I didn't kill him. Lester folded his arms. You were the one who was always closest to him. You were the last person he confided in. If anyone had the chance to... That's enough, Cray snapped. We'll handle the questioning, Lester. He turned back to Evelyn. Unless you can give me a reason to believe otherwise, you're our prime suspect. Evelyn swallowed hard, but she said nothing. Miss Marple, who had been watching carefully, finally spoke. It's all rather convenient, don't you think? Cray looked at her. What do you mean? The gloves, she said gently. They appear at just the right moment, with just enough evidence to condemn Miss March. A very tidy solution to an otherwise untidy case. Cray frowned. You think they were planted? I think, Miss Marple said, her blue eyes keen, that the real culprit is not done playing their part, and this inspector is merely the next act in their carefully constructed drama. Cray exhaled, his fingers tightening on his notebook. So you don't believe Evelyn did it? Miss Marple smiled. Oh, she has her secrets, Inspector. But murder? No, I don't think Miss March is quite so theatrical. Cray muttered a curse under his breath, which means we've just arrested the wrong person. And somewhere, in the shadows of the theatre, the true murderer was waiting, watching as their perfect performance continued to unfold. Miss Marple sat quietly in the dimly lit theatre, her hands resting lightly on her lap as the weight of the case pressed upon her mind. The arrest of Evelyn March had been swift, almost too swift. It was the sort of resolution that made the authorities feel accomplished, yet left an unpleasant hollowness in its wake. Miss Marple, however, knew better than to trust the obvious. The truth had a way of lingering in the shadows, waiting to be seen by those patient enough to look for it. She turned her attention to the stage, where the ghost of Nathaniel Pomeroy still seemed to linger. His presence was embedded in the very boards beneath their feet, in the velvet curtains that swallowed up light. Theatre was a place of illusion, of crafted narratives designed to mislead. And what was this murder, if not a script played out with the greatest precision? A soft shuffle broke her reverie. Jonathan Lester stood a few feet away, watching her with an uneasy expression. "You don't believe Evelyn did it, do you?" he asked. Miss Marple regarded him thoughtfully. "Do you?" Lester hesitated, then shook his head. "No, it doesn't feel right. I mean, yes, she had reason to be upset with Nathaniel, but murder, it's not in her nature." He paused, his fingers tightening at his sides. "I keep thinking about something he told me weeks ago, about the past. He was always obsessed with it, you know. He used to say that no one ever really escapes their history." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "And what, pray, did he mean by that?" Lester hesitated. "He didn't say outright. But I remember one night after rehearsal, he was deep in his drink and muttered something about old ghosts catching up with him." Miss Marple's fingers curled slightly. "Old ghosts, indeed." The past was a most inconvenient thing. It never stayed buried for long. Later that evening, Miss Marple requested to examine Nathaniel Pomeroy's personal belongings once more. Inspector Cray, though skeptical, granted her access. In the dim confines of the dressing room, she sifted through his papers, his notes, the scattered remnants of a life cut short. It was there, tucked beneath a pile of theatre programs, that she found it. A faded newspaper clipping, brittle at the edges. Her breath caught as she read the headline. "Tragedy at Langdon Manor. Actress found dead in lake, Langdon Manor." That name stirred something in her. She read on, absorbing every detail. The article was nearly 2 decades old, detailing the mysterious death of an actress named Margaret Harcourt. She had been a rising star, a woman of captivating beauty and talent, whose life had ended in murky water on a cold November night. The case had been ruled an accident, an unfortunate slip on the lakeside path. But some had whispered otherwise. Beneath the article, scrawled in Nathaniel Pomeroy's own hand, was a single line. She didn't fall. She was pushed. Miss Marple felt the weight of the words pressed down upon her. Margaret Harcourt. That name was not unfamiliar. The more she thought, the clearer the connection became. Margaret Harcourt had once been engaged to a promising young playwright, one whose talent had just begun to shine when scandal had overshadowed his work, a playwright named Roger Fielding. Miss Marple placed the clipping down carefully. The past was no longer a distant shadow. It had stepped forward, entwined with the present in ways that no one had yet seen. She left the dressing room and sought out Fielding, finding him in the theatre's lounge, nursing a glass of brandy. He looked up as she approached, his face weary. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, voice tinged with something almost like resignation. "Come to share another insight." She took a seat opposite him, folding her hands neatly. "Mr. Fielding, were you aware that Nathaniel Pomeroy had taken an interest in an old case, a rather tragic one?" Fielding's fingers tightened around his glass. I don't know what you mean. Margaret Harcourt, Miss Marple said softly. The color drained from his face. It was the reaction of a man who had spent years burying something, only to have it unearthed before him. What about her? He asked, too carefully. Miss Marple studied him. Nathaniel Pomeroy believed she was murdered. Fielding let out a short, brittle laugh. That's ridiculous. It was an accident. Was it? Silence stretched between them. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. You knew her well, didn't you? Fielding exhaled sharply, his gaze flickering. She was important to me. And yet, Miss Marple said gently, her death seemed to have ended more than just her life, didn't it? Fielding's lips pressed into a thin line. I don't see what this has to do with Nathaniel's murder. Miss Marple's voice remained steady. I think it has everything to do with it. She placed the newspaper clipping on the table between them. Nathaniel kept this, Mr. Fielding. Not just this. He had notes, scribblings. He was looking into it. I suspect he found something. Fielding's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his drink. And you think that's why he was killed? Miss Marple's gaze didn't waver. Don't you? Fielding was silent for a long moment. Then, in a voice so low it was nearly a whisper, he said, Margaret's death, it ruined everything. People whispered. They assumed the worst about me. My career nearly collapsed. But I had nothing to do with it. Miss Marple didn't respond immediately. Instead, she let the weight of his words settle. Then, after a pause, she said, perhaps not, but someone did. Fielding's gaze lifted sharply, and for the first time there was something raw in his eyes. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. The question, Mr. Fielding, is who? And whether they would be. Miss Marple sat back, watching Roger Fielding with the patience of a woman who had spent her life observing human nature. The tremor in his hand, the flicker of his gaze, it all spoke volumes. He had spent years treading carefully, stepping around an unspoken truth. And yet, now that Nathaniel Pomeroy had gone sniffing into the past, the ghosts he had tried to keep buried were stirring once more. Mr. Fielding, she said, gently, I've always found that the past has a rather inconvenient habit of resurfacing at the worst possible moment. And when it does, those who have something to hide often struggle to keep their stories straight. Fielding stiffened. I have nothing to hide, Miss Marple. She merely smiled, her blue eyes twinkling with something close to amusement. Of course, she murmured. Perhaps you wouldn't mind helping me with a small matter then? He hesitated. What sort of matter? She reached into her handbag and retrieved a small theater program, one from Pomeroy's most recent play. The edges were slightly worn, the pages folded back as if they had been thumbed through many times. She held it up between them. This was found among Nathaniel's things, she said. You must recognize it. Fielding frowned but nodded. Yes, of course. That's from A Perfect Execution. Indeed. She turned a few pages, then tapped one with her fingertip. I found something rather odd. You see this section here? Fielding leaned in, his eyes scanning the passage she pointed to. It was a section of the script, a dramatic monologue by the lead character, a playwright who, in the story, had been haunted by the accidental death of a woman from his past. The words were strikingly familiar. Miss Marple watched him carefully as he read, his brows knit together, confusion giving way to something deeper, something that made his jaw tighten and his fingers curl into his palm. This is... His voice faltered. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. Almost word for word what you just told me, isn't it? Fielding's breath hitched. She continued, her tone light, as if she were merely discussing a favorite novel. It's rather fascinating, don't you think? Nathaniel Pomeroy was many things but subtle. No, I wouldn't say that was one of his strengths. He was a man who liked his truths hidden in plain sight. And here, it seems he was writing about something, or rather, someone, from reality. Fielding's eyes darkened. "You think this is about me?" Miss Marple inclined her head. "Oh, Mr. Fielding, I think Nathaniel wanted you to see this play very carefully indeed." The silence between them thickened. Then Fielding laughed, a short, brittle sound. "You're very clever, Miss Marple," he admitted. "But you're reading too much into it. It's just a play." Miss Marple's expression did not change. "Oh, I do wonder," she mused. "It would be quite the coincidence, wouldn't it, that Nathaniel, who had been investigating Margaret Harcourt's death, just happened to write a play that mirrors your own past so very precisely." Fielding stood abruptly. "I've had quite enough of this," he snapped. Miss Marple remained seated, perfectly composed. "One last thing, Mr. Fielding." He turned back, his patience frayed. "What now?" Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "I have often found that when people tell a story from memory, the details stay the same. But when they fabricate one, small changes begin to creep in. Now, just a moment ago, you told me Margaret's death nearly ruined your career." She paused, letting the words settle. "But earlier, you said you had nothing to hide. How very peculiar." Fielding's face darkened. Miss Marple tapped the program once more. "It rather reminds me of Nathaniel's own words in his play. No one escapes their past, but the clever ones learn to rewrite it." A muscle ticked in Fielding's jaw. Then, without another word, he turned sharply and left. Miss Marple sighed, glancing down at the program. She had rattled him, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. Later that evening, back at the inn where she was staying, Miss Marple sat in her modest room, deep in thought. There was something unfinished about all of this. Nathaniel Pomeroy had discovered something about Margaret Harcourt's death, something that had gotten him killed. And Fielding, for all his protestations, was hiding something. But was he the killer? She reached for her handbag, retrieving the newspaper clipping once more. Margaret Harcourt's face stared back at her, a young woman full of promise, taken too soon. A thought struck her, sharp as a pinprick. Rising swiftly, she crossed to her desk and pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. With neat, deliberate strokes, she wrote down a name, then another, and another. The pattern was there. She had merely needed to see it. At that moment, there was a knock at her door. Miss Marple turned. "Come in." Inspector Cray stepped inside, looking harried. "I just came from the station. Evelyn March has been released." Miss Marple smiled. Very wise. Cray exhaled, running a hand over his face. "We're back to square one, though. No real suspect, no murder weapon." "Oh, I wouldn't say that, Inspector," Miss Marple said mildly. "I rather think we are closer than ever." Cray frowned. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple gestured to the paper on her desk. "I believe our murderer has been playing a most elaborate game. But they made a mistake." Cray leaned over to see what she had written. His eyes widened. Miss Marple folded her hands. "I think it's time we set a little trap, don't you? Willing to kill again to keep it buried." Miss Marple sat perfectly still, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the desk as Inspector Cray read the names she had written. A silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken conclusions. Then, just as Cray opened his mouth to speak, the telephone on the desk rang sharply, cutting through the hush of the room. Cray picked up the receiver. "Inspector Cray speaking." His posture tensed. "What? When?" He listened for a moment longer before muttering a terse, "I'll be there at once." He placed the receiver back onto its cradle with a grim expression. "What is it, Inspector?" Miss Marple asked, her voice calm but perceptive. "The evidence room at the station," Cray said, rubbing his temple. "There's been a break-in." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "And what, precisely, was taken?" Cray let out a breath. "Nathaniel Pomeroy's journal." Miss Marple rose smoothly, already reaching for her coat. "Then, Inspector, I do believe we must hurry." The ride to the station was tense, the air thick with unspoken questions. The weight of the lost journal pressed heavily on them both. It had been one of the few tangible pieces of evidence that connected Nathaniel's present fears with the shadows of the past. And now, conveniently, it had vanished. When they arrived, the constable on duty, a young, nervous-looking man named Cartwright, was already waiting, shifting anxiously on his feet. I was only gone for a few minutes," he stammered. "Went to fetch some papers from the other room. When I got back, the door was open. The lock had been forced." Cray's expression darkened. "And the journal?" "Gone, sir." Cartwright swallowed. "Only the journal. Everything else was left untouched." Miss Marple tapped a finger lightly against her chin. "How very selective," she murmured. Cray turned sharply. "We need to find out who had access to this building tonight." "Already checking, sir," Cartwright said quickly. "But no one saw anything. No signs of forced entry into the main station, just the evidence room." Miss Marple stepped forward, peering at the door. The lock had been snapped, but the job had been done cleanly, almost professionally. Not the work of someone acting in a fit of panic, but a calculated effort to remove something that posed a threat. "Who knew that the journal was here?" she asked. Cray sighed. "Not many people. Myself, the officers handling the case, and of course, the suspects we've questioned." Miss Marple clasped her hands together, her mind already weaving through the implications. Then someone among them must have realized that journal contained something dangerous, something worth stealing. She turned back to Cray. "Did you happen to read much of it before it was taken?" Cray hesitated, then nodded. "Some. It was mostly scribbled notes, thoughts Nathaniel had about people in his circle. Suspicions, little remarks about arguments and tensions." "Did he mention Margaret Harcourt?" Cray's brow furrowed. "Once or twice. Nothing concrete. Just that he believed her death wasn't an accident." Miss Marple hummed softly. "And now his thoughts have been erased." Cray ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident. Whoever took it knew exactly what they were doing. They didn't want us connecting the dots. Miss Marple, however, smiled faintly. "Oh, Inspector, I do believe they may have made a grave error." Cray blinked. "How do you mean?" She clasped her hands together, eyes twinkling with quiet amusement. "Stealing the journal tells us something rather important, doesn't it? It tells us that there was indeed something worth hiding. And more than that, whoever took it is someone who knew exactly where to find it." Cray's eyes widened slightly as the realization set in. "An inside job?" Miss Marple nodded. "Most certainly. The question was, who among them was desperate enough to take such a risk?" They left the station shortly after, the loss of the journal sitting like a heavy weight between them. The streets were quiet, the chill of the night pressing in around them. As they approached the theater, Miss Marple paused, glancing toward the building's darkened facade. "Inspector," she murmured, "would you indulge an old woman's intuition for a moment?" Cray sighed. "I suspect I have little choice in the matter." Miss Marple's smile was kind. "Quite right." She led the way toward the back entrance of the theater, her steps steady despite the uneven pavement. The door was locked, but a bit of careful maneuvering from Cray soon remedied that. They stepped inside, the scent of dust and old velvet wrapping around them. Miss Marple moved with quiet certainty, guiding them toward Nathaniel Pomeroy's dressing room. The space was as they had left it, untouched, a monument to the man's absence. She scanned the room, her gaze lingering on the desk where his journal had once been kept. Then, after a moment, she turned her attention to the wardrobe in the corner. "Inspector," she said lightly, "would you be so kind as to check behind those costumes?" Cray shot her a quizzical look, but did as she asked, pushing aside the heavy garments. A moment later, his fingers brushed against something and he exhaled sharply. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. Miss Marple stepped closer as he withdrew a small notebook. Thin, bound in worn leather. It was not the journal that had been stolen from the station, but it was something just as valuable. Cray flipped it open. Inside, pages were filled with hurried writing, notes scribbled in the margins. Names, dates, thoughts half-formed and then crossed out. Nathaniel's private notes. Miss Marple reached for it, skimming the pages with careful fingers, her lips pressed together in thought. Nathaniel was keeping 2 sets of records, she murmured. One official, one private. Cray let out a low whistle. And our thief didn't know about this one. Miss Marple's smile was small, but triumphant. How very fortunate for us. She turned the page, and suddenly, there it was, clear as day. A name that did not belong in this story at all. Cray saw it too. He shook his head. But that makes no sense. Miss Marple's voice was soft but sure. On the contrary, Inspector, I rather think it makes perfect sense. The stolen journal had been meant to throw them off the trail. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the name scrawled in Nathaniel Pomeroy's private notes, her mind working with quiet precision. The discovery of this second notebook was a stroke of luck, but it came at a cost. Whoever had stolen the original journal now knew the investigation was too close to the truth, and desperate people did desperate things. Inspector Cray rubbed his temple, rereading the name as though it might shift under scrutiny. I don't understand, he muttered. Why would Nathaniel write this down? He had no connection to... He stopped, his face darkening. Unless... Miss Marple shut the notebook gently, slipping it into her handbag. Unless, Inspector, he realized something too late. Cray exhaled sharply, shaking his head. We need to move. If our thief knows we're still on their trail, they might not stop at destroying evidence. He was right, of course, and Miss Marple had a growing suspicion that whoever had stolen Nathaniel's journal would not hesitate to remove another obstacle, permanently. They left the darkened theater behind and stepped into the night, the chill in the air sharper than before. A thin fog had begun to creep along the cobbled streets, muffling the distant sound of footsteps and carriage wheels. Then, without warning, a shot rang out. Cray barely had time to react before the bullet struck the brick wall beside them, sending bits of shattered mortar scattering onto the pavement. "Down!" he barked, grabbing Miss Marple's arm and pulling her behind a stack of wooden crates. His revolver was in his hand in an instant, his gaze scanning the dimly lit street. But whoever had fired was already gone, vanished into the fog like a phantom. Miss Marple adjusted her hat, her expression as composed as ever. Well, she murmured, I do believe that was meant for us. Cray let out a low curse under his breath. They're getting bold. That wasn't a warning shot. No, Miss Marple agreed. It was an attempt to silence us. She peered around the crates, her sharp eyes studying the street. There were no fleeing figures, no telltale sound of hurried footsteps. Whoever had fired had known exactly when and where to strike. Cray stood, still gripping his revolver. We need to get you somewhere safe. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Oh, Inspector, at my age I don't suppose anyone is ever truly safe. But I do believe we have something more urgent to attend to. He frowned. More urgent than an attempted murder? Miss Marple's gaze drifted back toward the theater, a thoughtful expression crossing her face. Our attacker was waiting for us, she said softly, which means they knew we would be here, and that suggests they've been watching us very carefully indeed. Cray's grip on his revolver tightened. Someone inside the case. Miss Marple nodded. Quite so. And if that's the case, then we must act before they do something truly irreparable. They hurried through the mist-laden streets, the weight of the night pressing down upon them. Miss Marple's mind was racing. Someone had just tried to kill them, but why now? The stolen journal had already been lost, unless, of course, their unknown adversary had just realized that they had missed something. A second crime was looming. She could feel it. When they arrived at the Harcourt estate, the house was dark, the great windows reflecting only the moonlight. Something about the stillness of the place sent a prickle of unease down Miss Marple's spine. Cray knocked sharply on the door. No answer. He knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. His jaw clenched. "I don't like this." Miss Marple stepped back, glancing toward the upper windows. Then she caught sight of it, a faint glimmer of movement behind the heavy curtains on the second floor. "Inspector," she murmured, "I do believe someone is inside." Cray didn't hesitate. He tried the door. Locked. With a swift motion, he stepped back and delivered a sharp kick near the handle. The wood splintered, the door swinging inward with a groan. They stepped inside, the silence thick and suffocating. The air was heavy with the scent of old books and polished wood, but there was something else too, something metallic and faint. Blood. Cray drew his revolver, moving swiftly through the dimly lit hall. Miss Marple followed at a careful pace, her eyes sweeping the shadows. Then they saw it. In the parlor, a figure lay sprawled across the floor. A man. His body twisted unnaturally, his head turned at an odd angle. A dark pool of blood was spreading beneath him. Cray swore under his breath. "Robert Alden." Miss Marple exhaled softly. So the villain was indeed one step ahead. Alden, the man who had so insistently played the role of concerned playwright, now lay dead at their feet. His face was frozen in a look of surprise, as though he had never seen it coming. Cray crouched beside the body, pressing 2 fingers against the man's throat. "Still warm," he muttered. "This happened not long ago." Miss Marple surveyed the room, her gaze flitting across the furniture, the fireplace, the overturned glass on the carpet. Then she noticed something, the faint imprint of a shoe in the blood, leading toward the open window. She followed it, stepping carefully until she reached the window frame. The curtains billowed slightly in the breeze. Someone had left in a hurry. She turned back to Cray. This was no random act. Mr. Alden was silenced. Cray looked up sharply. "Silenced? You think he knew something?" Miss Marple's expression was unreadable. "I think he knew too much." A deep silence settled between them. The weight of this second crime shifted the investigation entirely. This was no longer about uncovering the truth. It was about stopping the killer before they struck again. Cray exhaled, standing slowly. "Whoever did this, they're not finished." Miss Marple's fingers tightened around the handle of her handbag. "No," she agreed softly. "They are not." But in their desperation, the real murderer had just made a fatal mistake. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the name scrawled in Nathaniel Pomeroy's private notes, her mind working with quiet precision. The discovery of this second notebook was a stroke of luck, but it came at a cost. Whoever had stolen the original journal now knew the investigation was too close to the truth. And desperate people did desperate things. Inspector Cray rubbed his temple, rereading the name as though it might shift under scrutiny. "I don't understand," he muttered. "Why would Nathaniel write this down? He had no connection to—" He stopped, his face darkening. "Unless—" Miss Marple shut the notebook gently, slipping it into her handbag. "Unless, Inspector, he realized something too late." Cray exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "We need to move. If our thief knows we're still on their trail, they might not stop at destroying evidence." He was right, of course, and Miss Marple had a growing suspicion that whoever had stolen Nathaniel's journal would not hesitate to remove another obstacle, permanently. They left the darkened theater behind and stepped into the night. the chill in the air sharper than before. A thin fog had begun to creep along the cobbled streets, muffling the distant sound of footsteps and carriage wheels. Then, without warning, a shot rang out. Cray barely had time to react before the bullet struck the brick wall beside them, sending bits of shattered mortar scattering onto the pavement. "Down!" he barked, grabbing Miss Marple's arm and pulling her behind a stack of wooden crates. His revolver was in his hand in an instant, his gaze scanning the dimly lit street, but whoever had fired was already gone, vanished into the fog like a phantom. Miss Marple adjusted her hat, her expression as composed as ever. "Well," she murmured, "I do believe that was meant for us." Cray let out a low curse under his breath. "They're getting bold. That wasn't a warning shot." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "It was an attempt to silence us." She peered around the crates, her sharp eyes studying the street. There were no fleeing figures, no telltale sound of hurried footsteps. Whoever had fired had known exactly when and where to strike. Cray stood, still gripping his revolver. "We need to get you somewhere safe." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, Inspector, at my age, I don't suppose anyone is ever truly safe. But I do believe we have something more urgent to attend to." He frowned. "More urgent than an attempted murder?" Miss Marple's gaze drifted back toward the theater, a thoughtful expression crossing her face. "Our attacker was waiting for us," she said softly, "which means they knew we would be here, and that suggests they've been watching us very carefully." "Indeed." Cray's grip on his revolver tightened. "Someone inside the case?" Miss Marple nodded. "Quite so. And if that's the case, then we must act before they do something truly irreparable." They hurried through the mist-laden streets, the weight of the night pressing down upon them. Miss Marple's mind was racing. Someone had just tried to kill them, but why now? The stolen journal had already been lost. Unless, of course, their unknown adversary had just realized that they had missed something. A second crime was looming. She could feel it. When they arrived at the Harcourt estate, the house was dark, the great windows reflecting only the moonlight. Something about the stillness of the place sent a prickle of unease down Miss Marple's spine. Cray knocked sharply on the door. No answer. He knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. His jaw clenched. "I don't like this." Miss Marple stepped back, glancing toward the upper windows. Then she caught sight of it, a faint glimmer of movement behind the heavy curtains on the second floor. "Inspector," she murmured, "I do believe someone is inside." Cray didn't hesitate. He tried the door. Locked. With a swift motion, he stepped back and delivered a sharp kick near the handle. The wood splintered, the door swinging inward with a groan. They stepped inside, the silence thick and suffocating. The air was heavy with the scent of old books and polished wood, but there was something else too, something metallic and faint. Blood. Cray drew his revolver, moving swiftly through the dimly lit hall. Miss Marple followed at a careful pace, her eyes sweeping the shadows. Then they saw it. In the parlor, a figure lay sprawled across the floor, a man. His body twisted unnaturally, his head turned at an odd angle. A dark pool of blood was spreading beneath him. Cray swore under his breath. "Robert Alden." Miss Marple exhaled softly. So the villain was indeed one step ahead. Alden, the man who had so insistently played the role of concerned playwright, now lay dead at their feet. His face was frozen in a look of surprise, as though he had never seen it coming. Cray crouched beside the body, pressing 2 fingers against the man's throat. "Still warm," he muttered. "This happened not long ago." Miss Marple surveyed the room, her gaze flitting across the furniture, the fireplace, the overturned glass on the carpet. Then she noticed something, the faint imprint of a shoe in the blood, leading toward the open window. She followed it, stepping carefully until she reached the window frame. The curtains billowed slightly in the breeze. Someone had left in a hurry. She turned back to Cray. This was no random act. Mr. Alden was silenced. Cray looked up sharply. Silenced? You think he knew something? Miss Marple's expression was unreadable. I think he knew too much. A deep silence settled between them. The weight of this second crime shifted the investigation entirely. This was no longer about uncovering the truth. It was about stopping the killer before they struck again. Cray exhaled, standing slowly. Whoever did this, they're not finished. Miss Marple's fingers tightened around the handle of her handbag. No, she agreed softly. They are not. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the body of Robert Alden. Her mind sifting through every detail, every thread of deception spun throughout this tangled mystery. The playwright had met his end with startling precision. No struggle, no signs of hesitation from his killer. A single wound, swift and decisive. There was intent, practiced skill even. Not an act of passion, but one of necessity. Someone had wanted him gone before he could speak. But what exactly had he known? Inspector Cray straightened, his face set in grim determination. This was planned. Someone lured him here. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes sweeping the dimly lit parlor. The disorder was slight, but telling. An overturned glass, an indentation on the couch, a book placed hastily on a shelf as if in the midst of conversation. She moved toward the fireplace, studying the pile of ashes within. The fire had been used recently. Too recently. She crouched, plucking a small, charred fragment from the grate. It was brittle beneath her fingers, yet a faint edge of ink remained. A page from something important, destroyed before anyone could see. She turned back toward Alden's body, her thoughts aligning. A playwright, silenced, a missing journal, an attempted murder in the dark streets, and now a second crime staged with unsettling precision. The pattern was there, just beneath the surface, waiting to be unearthed. Cray ran a hand through his hair. Alden knew something, but about what? If he was working with Nathaniel Pomeroy, then... Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Not with him, Inspector. Against him. Cray frowned. You think Alden was blackmailing Pomeroy? Not blackmail, Miss Marple murmured. But Alden was not just a playwright. He was an observer. He saw things, and I believe he understood far more than we realized. That is why he was killed. She stepped carefully over to the bookcase, running a gloved finger along the spines. A playwright was a master of words, but also of human nature. Robert Alden had woven narratives for a living, constructing stories with precision. What if he had recognized a story playing out in real life, one the killer had not intended for anyone to see? She turned back toward the crime scene. Inspector, would you happen to recall something Mr. Alden said when we first spoke to him? Cray blinked. He said a lot of things, most of them laced with smugness. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Yes, but one thing stood out to me then, and even more so now. She tilted her head, recalling his words with clarity. The best plays write themselves, don't they? Some people can't help but play, their roles to the very end. Cray exhaled sharply. You think he was talking about the killer? Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the charred remains in the fireplace. I think he saw a performance unfolding before his eyes, Inspector, and I believe he wrote it down. Cray's expression darkened, and someone made sure that performance was never read. A silence settled between them, heavy with unspoken realization. Alden had not just been killed, he had been erased. Miss Marple stepped away from the bookcase, her thoughts clicking into place. The key to this mystery had always been in plain sight. The missing journal. The script Alden had refused to share. Nathaniel Pomeroy's staged death. It was all connected, but in a way none of them had considered. She turned sharply toward Cray. Inspector, where was Nathaniel Pomeroy's body found? Cray blinked at the sudden shift. In his study, At the theatre. Miss Marple's mind raced. And his journal, the one that was stolen, it was taken before we ever arrived. Cray frowned. Yes. We assumed the killer took it to cover their tracks. Miss Marple's lips pressed together. But what if it wasn't stolen at all? Cray's brow furrowed. Miss Marple, you don't think... She met his gaze steadily. Inspector, we have been looking at this all wrong. The journal was never stolen. It was planted. Someone wanted us to believe it had vanished. And Robert Alden, he knew why. Cray swore under his breath. And now Alden's dead. Miss Marple nodded, her voice quiet but firm, because he was the only one who saw the play for what it truly was. The weight of her words settled between them. The pattern had emerged at last, and if Miss Marple was right, the true culprit was still playing their role, waiting for the final act to begin. Miss Marple stood motionless, her keen eyes fixed on the dying embers in the fireplace. The last traces of Robert Alden's secret had been reduced to ash, yet the story he had glimpsed, the one that had cost him his life, was still waiting to be uncovered. She turned toward Inspector Cray, her voice calm but deliberate. Inspector, I believe we have been asking the wrong question all along. It is not simply a matter of who killed Nathaniel Pomeroy or Robert Alden, but why they had to be silenced in the first place. We assumed this was about a single crime, but I believe it is something much deeper, something that began long before either man died. Cray crossed his arms, his expression a mixture of frustration and reluctant admiration. Go on. She paced slowly, gathering her thoughts. From the moment we arrived, the focus has been on what Nathaniel Pomeroy knew, his journal, his secrets, his enemies. But perhaps we should consider something else entirely. What if Pomeroy was not the real target at all? Cray frowned. You think he was just... what? A distraction? A necessary one, Miss Marple murmured. Pomeroy was a man who thrived on secrets, but Alden was a man who observed. He saw past the facade, past the performances, and that was what made him dangerous. Cray exhaled, rubbing his temple. But what exactly did he see? Miss Marple turned back toward the bookshelf, her fingers brushing the spines lightly. Alden was not just documenting events. He was writing a story, a play, one that mirrored real life too closely for comfort. The killer must have realized this, which is why his script and journal were burned. But you see, Inspector, what truly interests me is not what Alden wrote, but what he intended to write next. Cray's eyes narrowed. You think the final act was missing? Miss Marple nodded. And for good reason. The true motive was not about silencing Pomeroy, nor was it about stopping Alden from publishing some sordid secret. No, Inspector, this was never just about power, money, or even revenge. She turned, fixing Cray with a steady gaze. This was about identity. Cray's jaw tensed. Identity? Miss Marple folded her hands before her. You recall, of course, that Nathaniel Pomeroy always carried an air of mystery about him. His past was elusive, his origins vague. He created himself, in a sense. But Alden, ever the playwright, must have noticed something that did not fit. And once he began to investigate, he found the truth lurking behind the curtain. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. Nathaniel Pomeroy was never who he claimed to be. He had stolen someone else's identity years ago, perhaps to escape a crime or to reinvent himself in a world that would never have accepted him otherwise. But there was one person who could never afford for that truth to come out. Cray's brow furrowed. You mean... Miss Marple nodded. Someone who had just as much to lose, someone who was connected to Pomeroy's past, who had built their entire existence on the same fragile deception, someone who realized that if Alden uncovered one secret, it would lead to another, and everything they had worked for would crumble. Cray stiffened. So they killed Pomeroy to protect themselves. And then Alden, Miss Marple said gently, because Alden, with his sharp eye for narrative, was beginning to put the pieces together. He may not have known the full truth yet, but he had sensed the inconsistencies. And so, the killer took the most logical course of action. They silenced him before he could write the final act. The inspector's face darkened as realization dawned. Then the real murderer isn't just covering up a single crime. They're covering up an entire life built on lies. Miss Marple inclined her head. And the tragedy, Inspector, is that they have spent so long maintaining their illusion that they were willing to kill to preserve it. Not out of greed, not even out of malice, but out of fear. A heavy silence stretched between them as the weight of her words settled. Then Cray inhaled sharply. Miss Marple, if you're right about this, then our killer isn't finished yet. Her lips pressed into a thin line. No, Inspector. I rather think they are waiting for their final curtain call. Miss Marple's gaze was steady as she smoothed the lace of her gloves, her mind sharpening the final edges of the trap she had so carefully set. The truth was no longer elusive, no longer tangled in shadows. She had seen it lurking beneath the surface from the very beginning in the way the players of this deadly drama spoke their lines. Some had been too eager, others too reluctant. But the real murderer, the true architect of these crimes, had revealed themselves in their desperation to silence the past. Now they would have nowhere left to hide. The clock on the mantelpiece chimed softly. The room was set, its occupants carefully chosen. Inspector Cray stood near the door, his posture deceptively casual, but his hand hovered near his coat pocket, where his revolver remained within reach. Around the drawing room, the others had been summoned under the guise of a final discussion. Each one believed they were here to witness the final unraveling of the case. None suspected they were already inside the snare. Miss Marple took her seat near the fireplace, arranging herself as if she were merely an elderly woman content to observe. But her eyes, sharp and knowing, found the one person who had the most to lose tonight. Lillian Pomeroy sat poised, her back straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The very picture of composure. Too much composure. A woman of control, of precision, of discipline. And yet, Miss Marple had seen the smallest crack in that perfect mask, the brief flicker of fear that had passed over her features when Robert Alden's death was announced. It was time to see if that mask would break entirely. Miss Marple spoke softly, her voice carrying through the quiet room. We have all been asking the wrong question, you see. It was never about who killed Nathaniel Pomeroy or Robert Alden, no, not truly. It was about why these crimes had to happen at all, why someone was so desperate to bury the past that they would kill to do so. There was a shift in the air, a subtle tension pulling taut. Lillian's hands tightened slightly, but she remained composed. Miss Marple continued, her tone light, almost conversational. Nathaniel Pomeroy built his life upon reinvention, upon illusion. He was a man who understood the power of deception. But what people failed to consider was this. Deception is rarely a solitary act. For every illusionist, there is always an accomplice, someone who ensures the trick succeeds, someone who stands in the wings, unnoticed, keeping the performance intact. She turned her gaze fully onto Lillian now. And in this case, that someone was you. A sharp intake of breath came from the others, but Lillian did not flinch. If anything, she seemed almost expectant. A woman who had known this moment might come, but had not yet decided how she would greet it. Inspector Cray spoke, his voice firmer. Miss Marple doesn't make accusations lightly, Mrs. Pomeroy. We know you are hiding something. We just don't know why. Lillian exhaled softly, tilting her head. You assume a great deal, Inspector. I assume nothing, Miss Marple replied gently. I observe. A flicker of something passed through Lillian's eyes, wariness, calculation. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Nathaniel was not the man you married, was he? Silence. And then, so quietly that it was almost lost beneath the ticking clock, Lillian spoke. "No," she murmured. The single word sent a ripple of shock through the room. Even Cray straightened slightly. Lillian's hands, so carefully composed, now trembled. "Nathaniel Pomeroy died years ago," she said softly. "Not in the way the world believes. Not as the famous playwright and benefactor. He died before any of this, and someone else took his place." Cray's face hardened. "And you helped him?" Lillian lifted her chin. "I protected him?" Miss Marple's voice remained steady. "But why? What did he have over you?" Lillian's lips pressed into a thin line. "He was my brother." The weight of the words sank into the room like a stone. The deception had never been a simple one. It had been a bond forged in desperation, in loyalty, in shared survival. The real Nathaniel Pomeroy had vanished, and a man who had once been nothing, a man with no name, no future, had taken his place. And Lillian, his sister, had ensured that the illusion was never broken. Until Robert Alden had begun to suspect. Until Alden had seen the truth hidden in plain sight. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "And when Alden began to write his new play, you realized he had seen too much." Lillian's breathing was shallow. Miss Marple tilted her head. "You killed Nathaniel first, didn't you? He had become careless. You knew it was only a matter of time before someone unraveled the truth. So you staged his death, hoping that would be the end of it. But Alden—" A bitter smile crossed Lillian's lips. "Alden was too clever for his own good." Cray's voice was sharp. "You burned his notes, destroyed the script." "But it was too late," Lillian murmured. "He already knew. He had written down too much. If I let him go on—" She exhaled, closing her eyes. "I had no choice." Miss Marple's expression was not unkind. There is always a choice. Lillian let out a quiet, humorless laugh. "You think so?" Her gaze drifted downward to her shaking hands. "I have been making the same choice for years, protecting the lie, protecting him, protecting myself, and in the end—" She lifted her head, her eyes gleaming with something close to resignation. "In the end, the lie became the only thing I had left." Silence settled once more. Then, slowly, Lillian Pomeroy rose to her feet. Her posture was regal, as if she were merely concluding a performance. A final bow before the curtain fell. Cray stepped forward, reaching for his cuffs. Lillian smiled faintly. "No need for restraints, Inspector. I'm not going anywhere." Miss Marple held her gaze for a long moment, then gave the smallest nod. "It is over now." And with that, the final act came to its close. As Inspector Cray led Lillian Pomeroy away, the room exhaled in collective relief. The air was heavy with the echoes of her confession, the weight of a truth long buried finally unearthed. Yet, despite the finality of it all, Miss Marple remained in her seat, fingers gently tapping against the armrest. Something was still unsettled, a faint, discordant note in an otherwise completed melody. It was not Lillian's confession that troubled her. No, that had been inevitable. It was the simplicity of it. Lillian had spoken of protection, of deception, of the lie becoming her life. But there was a missing piece. Something just outside of reach, teasing at the edges of Miss Marple's mind. She turned her gaze toward the fireplace, where the dying embers cast flickering shadows across the room. The case had begun with a playwright writing his own murder scene. Nathaniel Pomeroy, or the man who had taken his name, had built his entire existence upon stories, weaving lies into something more real than the truth. And yet, it was Robert Alden who had understood the final act before anyone else. Alden had seen something he had tried to put into his script before it was stolen and burned. The entire play had vanished, except for that one page left behind in the wastebasket. The single, ominous line, A man who plays too many parts forgets which is his own. Miss Marple sat up straighter, her mind clicking into motion. The line had been a clue, not just to Nathaniel's deception, but to something even greater. Alden had known too much, but not just about Pomeroy's true identity. Her breath caught. Alden had not been killed because he suspected Pomeroy's secret. He had been killed because he had seen something beyond it. The weight of understanding settled in, and Miss Marple rose swiftly, making her way toward the hall. The constables were still standing near the door, watching as Lillian was escorted into the waiting car. Inspector Cray turned as she approached, eyebrows lifting. "Something on your mind, Miss Marple." Her expression was serene, but her voice carried quiet urgency. "Inspector, I must ask, where is the play's original manuscript?" Cray frowned. "Burned, remember? Lillian made sure of that." Miss Marple shook her head. "She burned a script, yes. But do we know it was the script, or merely something she believed contained damning evidence?" Cray's brows furrowed. "What are you getting at?" She turned her keen gaze to him. "If Alden had truly written down everything he knew, do you think he would have kept just one copy?" Cray's eyes widened slightly. "You think there's another version?" "I think Alden was too clever to let his work be so easily destroyed. If he suspected someone might silence him, he would have left behind another copy, hidden somewhere safe." A chill ran through the inspector. And if Lillian wasn't the only one who wanted that script gone, then the real puppet master is still waiting in the wings, Miss Marple murmured. A sharp gust of wind howled outside as realization settled between them. The case was not yet over. The final act had not yet been written. Miss Marple stood in the study, her hands resting lightly on the back of a chair as she surveyed the quiet room. The air still carried the faint traces of smoke from the fireplace, where Lillian had burned what she had believed to be the only copy of Robert Alden's final work. But Miss Marple now saw what had been overlooked. The playwright had been too careful, too deliberate. Somewhere, his truth still existed. Inspector Cray paced the floor beside her, his brow furrowed. "You're certain Alden left another copy? If you're right, then whoever killed him still has reason to make sure it's never found." Miss Marple's eyes moved to Nathaniel Pomeroy's desk. The drawers had been searched before, but Alden had not been careless. He had woven secrets into stories, and Miss Marple knew that sometimes the best place to hide something was in plain sight. She approached the bookshelf, fingers brushing the spines of well-worn volumes. Then she stopped. A small, insignificant book sat tucked between two larger tomes, the collected works of Ben Jonson. She pulled it free. It opened too easily, too limply, as though the binding had been tampered with. Inside, nestled between the pages, was a carefully folded sheaf of papers. Miss Marple gently unfolded them, her eyes moving over the crisp, precise handwriting. Robert Alden's script, the true story. Cray let out a low whistle. Clever man. Hid his final act inside another playwright's work. Miss Marple read a few lines, her expression unmoving but her mind sharp as ever. "And here," she murmured, "is the truth it was worth killing for." She turned to Cray. "Inspector, the murder of Robert Alden was not about protecting Nathaniel Pomeroy's secret. Lillian Pomeroy believed she was covering for a man she loved, but she was only a pawn. The real mastermind was someone else entirely, someone who stood to lose everything if Alden's script was ever staged." Cray's frown deepened. "And that is?" Miss Marple's voice was calm, but the certainty in it was absolute. "Simon Greaves." The inspector blinked. "Greaves? The producer?" Miss Marple nodded. "He was Alden's benefactor, yes, but also his adversary. Alden's script wasn't just a play, it was a confession wrapped in fiction. He had uncovered financial misdeeds, deception, perhaps even past crimes tied to Greaves. He wrote it all down, disguised as theater, and Greaves realized too late what was about to be revealed. That is why Alden had to die. That is why the play had to be destroyed. Cray clenched his jaw. Then we need to find Greaves. If he realizes there's another copy. Before he could finish, a sharp sound came from outside. A car engine roared to life. Miss Marple moved to the window. A sleek black car was tearing away down the drive, the figure inside unmistakable. Simon Greaves was making his escape. Cray swore under his breath and ran for the door. Miss Marple followed at a composed pace, stepping outside just in time to see the inspector bark orders at his men. The police scrambled into their vehicles, tires screeching as they pursued Greaves down the fog-draped country road. The night air was cold against Miss Marple's skin, but she merely pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The truth had been revealed. Whether Greaves was caught tonight or not, justice had already begun its course. She turned back toward the house, toward the light and warmth of the study, where Robert Alden's last words still lay upon the desk. The playwright had ensured that his story would be told, and Miss Marple had ensured that it would be heard. Justice was not always swift, nor was it always neat, but it was, in the end, inescapable. As the night stretched on, the glow of the study's fireplace flickered against the polished wooden shelves, casting shifting shadows along the walls. Miss Marple sat quietly in one of the armchairs, her hands folded neatly in her lap, watching the flames dance. Inspector Cray had left not long ago, his men in pursuit of Simon Greaves, and the house had settled into an uneasy hush. The mystery had been unraveled, the guilty party unmasked, yet something nagged at the edges of her mind. Robert Alden had been meticulous, a man of precision in both words and actions. Every scene he crafted had purpose, every line delivered meaning. His final work had laid out the tangled deception that had led to his own murder, but was that all it contained? Miss Marple leaned forward, her fingers brushing against the stack of Alden's manuscript resting on the table. She turned the pages with care, her eyes scanning the words not for what was obvious, but for what was left unsaid. A passage caught her eye, seemingly innocuous dialogue between characters, a moment buried within the play's second act. A character, speaking in jest, made a passing remark about a letter hidden within the pages of an old book. A book. Miss Marple sat back, her expression unreadable. Robert Alden had hidden his script in the collected works of Ben Jonson. That much had been discovered. But what if there had been something more? Rising from her chair, she moved to the bookshelf once more. Her fingers drifted along the spines, then returned to where the Jonson volume had sat. The books beside it had been untouched, unremarked upon. She pulled one free at random, a slim, aged volume. The pages felt slightly stiff, as if they had not been turned in years. As she fanned them gently, something small and folded slipped loose, fluttering to the floor like a withered autumn leaf. She bent down and retrieved it, carefully unfolding the fragile paper. A letter. The ink had faded, but the handwriting was still legible. It was addressed to Robert Alden, dated years before his murder. The words were brief, yet laced with urgency. If you have truly found the truth, then you know it must never be spoken aloud. There are those who will do anything to keep it buried. Be careful, Robert. What lies behind the curtain is far more dangerous than you realize. There was no signature. Miss Marple's fingers traced the edge of the letter thoughtfully. So Alden had not been acting purely out of creative defiance. He had known the danger long before his play had ever been written. Someone, long ago, had tried to warn him. A soft creak on the floorboards made her turn. Lillian Pomeroy stood at the threshold, her face pale, her eyes locked on the letter in Miss Marple's hands. "You found it," she whispered. Miss Marple nodded. It seems Robert Alden was aware of far more than he let on, and yet he chose to move forward regardless. Lillian hesitated, then took a step forward. "I don't know who wrote that letter," she said, "but I know he received others. I found torn pieces in his wastebasket once. burned fragments in the fireplace. He never spoke of them, but I think he was afraid. Miss Marple regarded her with a steady gaze. Afraid of Simon Greaves? A flicker of doubt crossed Lillian's face. I thought so, but now I'm not sure. Greaves had motive, yes. But what if Alden was being watched by someone else? The room was silent except for the distant ticking of the clock on the mantel. Miss Marple folded the letter carefully and slipped it into the pocket of her cardigan. Perhaps, she said softly, this mystery is not quite over after all. She moved past Lillian toward the door, stepping into the dimly lit corridor. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of sirens could still be heard, chasing justice through the night. But justice, Miss Marple knew, was rarely as simple as it seemed. Some truths remained hidden, waiting to be uncovered in their own time. As she stepped out into the cold air, she allowed herself the faintest of smiles. The case of Robert Alden's murder had been solved, but the story was far from finished.